Welcome to the Explainer. So, you know that feeling when you're looking at a chair or a desk and you just wonder, what actually makes this good design? Today, we're unpacking contemporary furniture design, and we're zeroing in on a massive core tension that basically drives the entire industry. It's the battle between aesthetics and engineering, the beautiful versus the clever. It's a wildly fascinating dynamic that completely shapes the environments we literally live and work in every single day. So, when you look at your own furniture, like, say, the desk you're sitting at right now, or maybe that bookshelf you swore you were going to assemble correctly the first time, would you describe it as beautiful or clever? It's a super relatable dilemma, right? We interact with these objects constantly, but we rarely stop to think, hey, did I buy this because it looks amazing or because it solves a functional problem brilliantly? Figuring out how we answer that question, that is the absolute key to understanding modern design. And this divide is perfectly captured in the design world. On one side, we've got visual originality, the aesthetics, the beauty. According to our source material, this is what totally dominates the mainstream conversation. It's easily the most celebrated trait of contemporary furniture. But on the flip side, we have technical and functional innovation, the clever structure. For the folks deeply invested in what makes a piece tick, beauty is, undeniably important, but without some serious material or structural expertise backing it up, a lot of designers feel a piece just lacks real substance. Yet somehow, this clever engineering gets totally ignored by the mainstream buyer. Now here's the real crux of the issue. The source material points out something super interesting. For many consumers, even designers, the most useful semantic differential available to describe a piece of furniture would be somewhere between beautiful and clever. And honestly, that right there is the entire foundation of our explainer today. While the design literature loves to harp on technical innovation, the stuff that actually sells, the most popular contemporary furniture out there, is predominantly visually original. Or at the very least, that's the easiest trait for people to connect with. So you might be wondering, how did we even get to this hyper-design conscious market where this debate actually matters to the average person? Well, let's look at Section 1, the 1980s design explosion. A historical shift? The thing you've got to understand is just how fast this all evolved. Everything pretty much exploded in the 1980s, an era often called the designer decade. This was when design stopped being a niche industry thing and became deeply ingrained in mainstream culture across the globe. Suddenly, the general public actually cared. Then we hit the 2000s. Our source notes this era brought an absolute exponential boom in the number of leading-edge designers, new philosophies, and methodologies. And today, well, the internet has basically fueled an unprecedented amount of design activity. It spreads ideas globally in seconds and gives us all instant access to this massive back catalog of design classics. There is literally more design activity happening right this second than at any other point in human history. But here's the catch. Despite this massive explosion of activity, true progress is actually kind of subtle. Groundbreaking work usually excels in just one category. The source does acknowledge that, sure, some very rare pieces manage to be visually, technically, and functionally eloquent all at once. But the vast majority of groundbreaking stuff, it heavily leans into either visual originality or technical innovation. The boundaries blur, obviously, but continuous innovation in the space usually happens by pushing incredibly hard in one specific direction rather than trying to perfectly balance the two. Which brings us to Section 2, composition and the golden ratio. Rules versus intuition. So what's the actual secret sauce here? How do designers land on the exact shapes, forms, and proportions that end up in our living rooms? Well, you've probably heard of this concept, the golden section, or the golden ratio. It's a mathematical, quote-unquote, divine proportion historically used to achieve aesthetic perfection in composition. For centuries, this math standard has been held up as the absolute, rigid foundation of all good design, from ancient architecture right up to classical paintings. There's this pervasive assumption out there that true beauty is just a mathematical formula waiting to be applied to your dining table. But actually, scratch that. The math myth doesn't entirely hold up. Our source explicitly points out that the strict use of these divine proportions is way less widespread than people think. It's actually surprisingly rare. In reality, modern designers instinctively approximate proportional relationships. The arrangement of components, mostly decided through raw intuition. And perhaps most importantly, the actual dimensions are heavily based on interpreting user needs. It's not about, meticulously punching numbers into a calculator. It's a highly intuitive, very human-centric process. Let's make this concrete with Section 3, a case study on Barber Osgerby Associates' satellite cabinets. To truly grasp this whole composition theory, we need a tangible example. And who better to listen to than the designers themselves? Barber Oscarby Associates describes their modular satellite cabinet system with this really fascinating quote. They call it an exercise in graphic composition and organized volumes about proportion, modularity, and purity with character, a series of ideograms. That's a pretty intense way to describe a piece of furniture, isn't it? They aren't just talking about a box to shove your paperwork into, they are talking about spatial poetry and visual language. Now, they use the word ideograms, which, yeah, sounds a bit academic, so let's break that down. An ideogram is basically a visual character or symbol that loosely and succinctly represents an idea. Think of a simple, communicative graphic icon on your phone. Our source notes that while you could argue a lot of furniture loosely represents an idea, BOA's statement just perfectly nails the compositional character of this specific system. The cabinets aren't just storage, they function as symbols communicating the very idea of structure. So how does this whole ideogram concept actually play out in real life? First off, while several modular combinations are possible, customers actually have to lock in their choices at the time of purchase. It's not one of those systems you can just endlessly reconfigure in your living room on a whim. Second, let's look at the materials. The cabinets themselves are just standard lacquered MDF carcasses. Honestly, on their own, totally unremarkable. And this is the kicker, they are supported by these very obvious leg frames. And that brings us to step 3. The stark geometric contrast between those simple cabinet boxes and the structural leg frames completely elevates the entire system. It transforms the whole thing into something significantly greater than the sum of its parts. It's this perfect marriage of intuitive aesthetic composition and really clever structural contrast. Which brings us to the end of our analysis. So here's a thought to leave you with. The next time you sit down at a desk or open a cabinet in your own home, ask yourself, is this just a beautiful object, or are you actually interacting with a clever series of ideograms? Are you just taking in the surface aesthetic, or can you spot the subtle, intuitive engineering and those stark contrasts that elevate it? Once you start understanding that delicate balance between the beautiful and the clever, I promise you it completely changes how you experience the objects you interact with every single day. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep looking closely at the design in your world.